Hi.
Hey, Keonna. I'm just typing a little comment in at the bottom so people know who you are. Keonna Hendrick. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in today. I'm trying to type sideways. I'm sorry for tilting my head. Okay. Posting. I'm going to pin that little comment so people who tune in later will still know who you are. Um, Hey, all. We're here. Hi, Blake. I'm sorry, did I miss anybody else waving? Oh, hi, Mom. And hi, Simon. Hi, Nelson. Um, Hi, all. I'm trying to sit here so you can see some artwork in the background. I'm outside the Aspen Art Museum this afternoon. We're on the sidewalk out front. Hey, Annie. Um, oh, Ashley. Hi. um,
Hey, Ashley. Mafe. Hi, Mafe.
yeah.
Hi, Simone.
Hey, Simone.
We can say hi to everybody.
I know. We'll just spend the whole time saying hi to everyone. That'll be our conversation. So I'm sitting outside today, and I am hoping that sound wise, I've got my headphones on, and so I hope we don't have too much background noise from cars and things. But if anybody is having trouble hearing, please feel free to chime in the comments. We can adjust. Hey, Lauren.
Hi,
Um,
Lauren.
and so we're doing our weekly Slow.Look.Live kind of focused conversation. Oh, thank you for the sound check validation, Simone. I appreciate it. Um, and I am here with Keonna Hendrick, who I always really love the way that you identify yourself in your own press as a cultural strategist, as well as an educator and an author. And we can talk about how we know each other. But I wonder if you feel like, do you want to identify yourself in any other particular ways today?
I think that sounds
Okay.
great. Yeah.
Okay. Um, thank you, Annie. And and hi to all of the people who are joining in. I will say as we go, I think a lot of people that are chiming in, either Keonna or I or both of us know you, whether we know you or not. Feel free to chime in with comments and questions in the chat, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat and bring some of those questions or comments into our conversation. Um, but yeah. So, so um, one of the things that we were talking about in kind of like the preparation for this is just like how are we trying to do our best work now? Like we're both museum educators, among other things, but that's kind of where we connected. Um, I don't know. Maybe we should explain. We used to work together
At the Brooklyn Museum.
at
And
MoMA.
at MoMA, yeah. At MoMA
I
as
know.
well, yeah.
Um, and I feel like, I mean, I wanted to invite you to come and do this because I feel like you have always been a colleague, whether we were immediately working together or not, that I feel like was a real kind of like vision setter or visionary, like someone who was always kind of thinking like several steps ahead about where museum education needed to go, and then was really like clever and thoughtful and ethical about getting there
Mm.
and matching up the work to that. Um, so I guess with that in mind, we were starting to talk about like how are we doing that kind of work now in such a weird moment?
Yeah.
And I
Um,
don't know, do you want like what are you thinking about as you're kind of guiding um, how we do our best work in this moment kind of principles?
Man, so many things really. So, we talked a little bit last week and we've been checking in with each other the last few, it's all right. I've got sound in the background too. We've
Okay.
been checking over with each other, like especially since the start of COVID around, how are we doing and navigating our roles in these different institutions, and just bigger roles that we're like that we own in the field. And for me, it's been really challenging. Like it's been really hard.
Yeah.
If I can be vulnerable enough to say that, it's been really hard because I think the piece that I'm wrestling with now is just like, what does how do you how do how does a conversation translate? And the conversation is essentially it is the same conversation, but how the mechanics of the conversations that I've been having, and the work that me and my team that I've been doing, um, translate in this virtual realm, especially when there's a question of access and who access, timing, uh, openness, to these discussions, like in this space where we it's harder to get in the same room. You know, we can be in the same virtual room, but the same physical room, especially around such tender areas. And so, just a little bit like, and what I'm talking about with that, I am the school programs manager at the Brooklyn Museum. I'm also someone who, has been doing a lot of work around, pushing our field forward towards, more inclusive practices, particularly around race, and ethnicity. And so, um, really got my work galvanized, I think more intentionally around anti-racist practices after Michael Brown, was murdered, through collaboration with Dr. Melissa Crum at Mosaic Education Network and Dr. Mara Dewhurst at City College. And we've been just doing a lot of collaborative work over the last few years, writing, and just, it really started off as like a labor of love, and also a labor of pain of, as a Black woman being in a field that historically has not made space for Black women, needing to, be able to really write down and help as much as I can and fill in the gaps of lack of like literature, scholarship, but also just kind of evidence around opportunities for growth, um, in these areas, particularly when it comes to anti-Blackness and, very like white supremacist, ways of thinking within museums. And so that's a little bit about my background. And my work is driven by a real belief that I do think museums have a lot of resources, even though nonprofit culture will tell us we don't. Maybe the budget line doesn't always show that, but like the information, the objects, the collections, the creativity, the artistry, the staffing, like those are the assets, right? And my work has been about how do we utilize those assets to broaden our community and make our community more caring. So when I say like it's been hard in this space is because so much of what we have done, um, through that work of bringing in people to communities, like physically, like going to, schools, or physically going into museums, or physically getting close to people, right? And so I think, for us, or at least for me, the, being in this virtual world, it's like almost like a new playground in some ways, and it's really exciting because it it brings to light all these things that, disability justice, advocates have been saying for like decades, that we've been, like I'd say, like I personally in some ways have been like kind of overlooking or not listening close enough to, that I'm like, oh shoot, someone did remind me of that 5 years ago. Um, at the same time, the heavy lifting of really trying to transform the programming and translate it to this space is hard. I think, but with that, it makes reminds me that now more than ever is the time to like stay grounded in my values, right? So what is the thing that brings me here? What's the thing that keeps me here? It keeps me believing in this work, right? Because we could all go off and do something else, but there's something that keeps me in cultural institutions, that keeps me connected to the arts and humanities. And so I've had to like really do a lot of meditation and prayer and stillness and reflection, and remind myself of like that purpose in work, and how do I try to like lead with that purpose, and not get caught up in all of the noise.
If you have that secret, please share it with the world.
I'm definitely I know I'm
No,
definitely
but it's true, because I think like so much, and we've been talking, like my team here in education at the museum has been talking about this too. It's like so much of what we do is being physically in community with each other,
hmm
right? In the museum or off site somewhere or out and about, just like talking to people. Yeah, like agreed, Lauren. Like yes to meditation and reflection. Slowing down is really needed. And I feel like that's one thing that we've really been working or trying to work through as a team.
yeah,
Is like, what does it look like to kind of slow down and focus so that we don't lose our values in this
yeah,
time, just in the need to like, or the the supposed need to sort of like keep programming going and be a continued part of people's lives in the same way we have been. It's like, it's not going to be the same way. Doesn't mean we will go away, but
Yeah,
you,
absolutely. Um, yeah, I think that like the slow walk, like this is gonna last for a while, probably. Like, who knows?
yeah,
Who knows, right? Also, like, am I in a rush to go back to the old ways that actually kept us in a tailspin?
it's
Um,
true.
yeah, and there are still this moment now where, or these moments, where everyone's kind of been scrambling. I see across our fields, like people are losing their jobs. People are, institutions are closing. There's a frenzy in operating from a space of fear that honestly for myself, I was like, I'm kind of tired of that. Doesn't mean that like I don't have to check myself on that. Some of my staff members on here, I see them, like they check me a lot, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
um, but it does come down to like making that space to start with self. And it's selfish. That sounds really selfish to educators a lot. Like, well, it should be student centered. And I'm like, I had to kind of come to this moment where I'm like, no, actually, it was always about self first, because that's where my biases like come from, right? And so even when we were in person, like I'm coming to the work with a sense of purpose for what I want to accomplish. I have my own preferences, right? I have the things that I like, and I have to continuously be in the rhythm of checking them, or else it becomes really uh, unethical, in some of my partnership building, when I'm not checking those biases, right? So I even need to like knowing that we're in an unconventional moment now, to say the least.
I'll
I
say.
have to be even more attentive to, okay, let me clear my lens for a second. What am I putting fear into this meeting with staff members? Am I creating more of a hype that needs to be with this partner, right? Do we need to slow down, or do I need to slow down and try to scratch something off of the list, right? Maybe we're trying to do too much, right? Because we're trying to save the world right now, right? Or maybe there are times where I'm like, oh, you're getting lazy and you actually need to push further, right? And like
Yeah.
we could be doing more and be a little bit more aggressive and explicit about it.
Well,
So
and
go
I
ahead.
think
I'm
that
sorry.
it's like that idea about like needing to put yourself first sometimes, and that is not kind of like the educator mode.
Yeah.
And I would argue it's also not like how in the United States I would say it's not how women are kind of acculturated to put themselves first. Like there are, many layers of people who are or are not encouraged to put themselves first in certain
Yeah.
situations.
Absolutely.
And like the fact that some of this moment is kind of calling for us to do that is like apart from the work, that's just like a hard personal thing for a
It's a
lot of
really
people to
hard thing to
do.
do, I think, a lot of. And I don't think it needs to be self-indulgent, to a degree that it excludes others. That's not what I'm saying. That's not the goal of
No.
that. I think the goal is to like really stand firm and like, okay, why am I here? What am I doing? And what stories or narratives or perspective am I operating from? Because what I also see, and especially with when I think about like my work inherently has been about giving expanding our sense of community, and taking institutions where my parents might not have felt comfortable, or my grandparents weren't even welcome, and to extend resources to those communities, and also really to give people of color breathing room. Like I'm personally really inspired by like how can I build breathing room for people of color,
Yeah.
whether they're on staff or whether we're in partner communities or schools. Um, how can that happen so that then we can be better equipped to chip away at some of the broader systemic issues, and then also some of the institutional um, forms of oppression that actually manifest. And so if I know that, then I have to think about, okay, I as a person of color need to give myself some breathing room, and I need to be really clear about like, okay, is that led by a sense of abundance, or is that led by a sense of fear? Because I know that when we operate from a sense of fear, what ends up happening is that we end up get into these cycles of haste and very short. I know I can be really short. I have to be honest with you. I can be really short, and we get into this thing of like productivity or like more, 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 now, 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 and that does actually just bolster up these like white supremacist ways of thinking. This like white supremacy culture um, that takes us back to the status quo that's been in museums, right, or been in corporations, and that capitalism really exemplifies. Um, and there's some parts of, don't get me wrong, there's some parts of productivity that I really enjoy. That's part of my personality. But there
Well,
are
we're
other
also
parts
like
that
you're ambitious and you have goals and
I'm ambitious, I have goals,
yeah,
right? But then there are also parts that are really destructive, and there are parts that don't allow other people to also be ambitious or have goals or allow them to play in the same spaces that I play in or the spaces that they want to play in to build those spaces or just to not partake at all. So I recognize that because that fear bolsters actually takes me away from the values, right? And those moments when I have to catch myself now, even in meetings, like where I'm like, am I getting defensive because of fear? And sometimes it is, right?
yeah,
And that actually stops the development and the creativity that can happen on a team.
yeah.
Um, the other piece I would say that I feel like has been really helpful to think about, and particularly going back to thinking about our goals or our purpose in the work, particularly our anti-oppressive purposes, is really looking at um, the histories that are before us. And I've been thinking so much about all the people who are in community with me and the lessons they have taught me, and like just reaching out and checking in, and also thanking them, going back to literature of our foreparents whose shoulders we stand on, those who have been fighting like within our institutions, outside of our institutions, and calling their names in,
Yeah.
and also recognizing those moments when they were denied their own truth in those fights. Like shout out to Radia Harper. I don't know if
Um,
I
I'm
don't think
I'm wearing my Radia Harper gifted bracelets
oh
right now.
Radia Harper, for those of y'all on the call, was a long-standing education director at the Brooklyn Museum who magic. Who actually just did the Lord's work and was really working with a lot of people there to really push our education practice towards culturally responsive teaching, um, really thinking and troubling hiring practices. And that's not a dig at anybody else who was there with her, because she did that in community with other people who were, you know, in that institution pushing it forward. And we're thankful for all of those people. But she has been a mentor to us, and I think teaching us a lot earlier in our careers, along with Claudine Brown, if anybody's heard of Claudine Brown, uh, and so many others. So really uplifting those histories and excavating those histories. And that's important because we see that happening in the public sector, right? We're seeing more people calling on Baldwin, and we're seeing people talk about Toni Cade Bavara, right? And like a lot of people didn't know who she was, but they're like, okay, I'm hearing this voice. They're bringing in those voices now. And all of our other elders who are, fighting these good fights. Marsha P. Johnson, right? Like, I think is getting more national attention for her activism than probably she has ever gotten.
Yeah.
Um,
I feel like people are like quoting Audre Lorde, who I never would have thought of as like reading Audre Lorde. Like, yeah,
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, so people are doing the excavation. I think it's really important for us to do the excavation within our institutions. And a lot of time in those institutions, I'm going to say it, it's a lot of brown and black people, especially brown and black women, who were either the only people in their department, or they were working solo dolo, or they were, kind of pushed out. And so how do we really like call in their names? Really look at the work and the legacies they left behind and learn from them and continue to learn from them. Um, and then the other pieces that I just wanted to kind of say is like, this is such a great opportunity to start from scratch and rethink the way we work. And that's scary and really messy, and it's annoying and frustrating. And I know like my team, we've been having a lot of meetings, and I probably been driving them crazy a little bit, but I'm like, we have to kind of get into this mess right now. in order for us to clear it out and start to connect the dots and trim the fat. So that we can think about like what actually do we want to build? What actually do you want to salvage from the past? And how do we sit with teams like community members? And when I say community, I'm really specific, like our school partners, our funders who have been riding with us for a while, who are believing in what we do, new funders who are like, wait, there's an opportunity here and that we didn't think about this before, right? Other staff members in the building who are like, I always loved what you do. I just never thought it could fit in our job description, and be really creative and bold about what that can be while still stopping ourselves and reminding like ourselves to be like, okay, let's do this in a way that's sustainable, and that's a way that we can like really build it out so that people um, who we're partnering with externally can also receive it in ways that they need, and they can, help us adjust it along the path. Um,
Well, and you also, I feel like you also have talked about over the years, but also in our lead up to this conversation, like that line between being like listening and being responsive to these various constituencies of people, right? Whether it's your colleagues or like the neighbors of the institution or a school that you're working with, like whoever the specific um, group is that you're working with. But then, like, where do you also draw that line where it's like, cool, if you, partner person or partner organization, want to come and work with me, like, I need you to agree that we're going to work in this way, like to hold your values together and to not lose that.
Well, you know what? I've been doing it more as a consultant. Also, like everyone's in a frenzy now, so I'm getting a ton of emails, and people are like, "We need this emergency conversation on
Of
Monday.
course.
Can you? It's like Thursday. Can you help us out on Monday?" We tried to do it, and it went well. It went wrong, and I'm like, no and no, because not that I don't want to help, not that I don't want to support, and I know that this work has to be intentional, and it's not, if we are going back to the haste of prior and this idea of like you just want to get it done and get it done and say you got it done, that's actually not the work. Uh, that's actually goes against anti-racist frameworks. So let me jump back a little bit. I define anti-racism um, really as the ongoing process of dismantling racism for the redistribution of power. And that involves an excavation and interrogation of frameworks that support racism, that are economic, that are political and judicial, that are based on social cultural constructions, as well as thinking about the arts and creativity as well. So we have to look at it through all of those lenses. And a big part of that, doing that anti-racist work, is that yes, we want to start, and sometimes we just have to jump in. However, it has to start also with some mutual respect. So for me, us starting together comes with thoughtfulness. I want to make sure that when I'm working with a client, so to speak, but really a partner, that we're partnering. We're going to do this together. You're not looking at. This is why a lot of diversity consultants are getting flack, because this idea that, oh, you're going to come in, you're going to fix it, you're going to teach somebody how to do something, and we're going to get the certificate and move along. And that's just not how this works.
Like, check,
This
now I'm anti racist. Like,
Exactly. Now I got and unfortunately we see that a lot when it comes to the sexual harassment certifications, right? Oh, I did this thing online. I'm not going to sexually harass people, but we know that folks get sexually harassed after you get their certificate,
right.
right? Um, this is not about that. This is about starting your own self-driven education. That's what it is for me. And so if it's a self-driven education, that is to result into the redistribution of power. We've got to move from inquiry to action, right? We've got to move from, let me look at self, let me examine like what actually and who actually informed my understanding of my own racial identity, my understanding of other people's racial identities, the intersection of race with other identity frameworks, right? Um, who actually reaffirm those narratives, and who actually and how would those narratives actually countered along the way. And so what that means is that, and then how do they actually show up in my prejudices and my biases, right? Prejudices against something or someone, and biases for something or someone. Because what that means is that now we're moving into a sense of accountability. And so I'm not interested in the transactional work of like, let me just give you this list of do's or don'ts. And then you can put them into practice. No, it's about, I can make recommendations for that. But it's about you really understanding, well, why is this a problem, or why is this actually impactful, and understanding the consequences so that when you're in different contexts we make better decisions, right? And I expect that for people who are teaching me or I'm in partnership with.
Yeah.
Call me in on that stuff. I got a great team at Brooklyn Museum. Yay, Brooklyn Museum educators. I see some people there. Ray, I see you there. Who
Current
call
and
me.
former, they're
Yes,
all they're all
and
on this
former
call.
people who call me in, right? And
Yeah.
so that's about that work. We're trying to create a culture of I'm not interested in a cancel culture, but like a culture of calling each other in areas where we can grow and giving extending grace for that, right?
Yeah.
And that's why
Well,
we're learning with each other. Yeah,
and I
I'm
think
talking, I'm rambling. You set
no,
me
it's
off on
good.
my soapbox.
I know, but it's a good soapbox. I like this soapbox, and you stand on it and talk very eloquently. So, but I think you have always been one of those colleagues for me, right? Like, it doesn't mean that like I have always understood things in the same way that you have understood things, but you have definitely called me in some moments that have been really helpful for me to examine my own like biases, my own prejudices, like where I'm coming from, what I can do with my position. Like, as you know, I'm like, as I often say, I'm like the squarely most overrepresented demographic in art museums. I'm like a highly educated, privileged white lady who comes out of like academic art history.
Yeah.
Like, and I got into museum education out of like the very, altruistic idea of like, I want to make art feel approachable to
Mm,
people and I want to make museums feel approachable to people, but like without further critical examination of why that's not true or how to do that for different people or in different situations or with different artworks. It's like that's like an empty kind of motivator, I guess.
no, well, it's a prominent one, and I got into it for that too initially, right? I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna save all the black people, like, and and I think those are both different types of savior syndrome.
Yeah.
And when I talk about savior syndrome, what I'm really talking about is this idea that like I need to, or the opinion that we are in the position and we have the responsibility of uplifting the people,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that I in my team, like at the museum, we look for when we hire is that you're not trying to actually save anybody. You don't think anybody needs to get saved, and you're not also thinking anyone can't do. You know, and so we're trying to move beyond that deficit ideology of thinking, because frankly enough, like people of color, historically marginalized communities have always been leading when it comes to, right, like building our futures, right? There was like this wonderful, we've always been leading that this wonderful video going around. My friend Cyrus Marcus Ware posted it from the Toronto Black Lives Matter group, and I'm so sorry I can't think of one of the organizers' name. Robin. Anybody remember? Put in the chat. Robin.
Chime in.
Um, this wonderful organizer who was talking about the destruction of a monument, and explaining like we have done everything, to preface them, like we've done everything to get your attention. We've like written letters, got petitions, signed plays, signed signed petition for you. We've made art, performance art, visual art. Like we've done everything and given you a blueprint. So this was the only thing to get your attention. And I bring that up because I say this moment when this person, Robin, is talking about like we keep making these blueprints, and you see that like within communities of color have always been finding joy, have always been creating and innovating and problem solving in ways that have served the mass populace, um, and frankly don't need to be saved. Like I don't need to go ahead and try to save kids in East New York. if anybody, they probably could be helping me out more than I'm helping them out. But what we can do here is partner and share our resources in ways that make sure everybody gets to eat, right? That make sure that we all get to grow in the ways that we want to grow. And that's, to me, I think that goes back to some real community liberation, right? Starting with the economics. So for my team, and this goes back to your question about partnering, right? We're really, I'm of the mindset that I want to be really transparent with people. Like, as a consultant, I'm like, this is what we charge, but this also, like, we're talking about what can you afford. If I know that, like, you're a smaller organization and they're bigger organizations, and I'm like, I know you can afford more and you can pay us more, and I have to stand with that. And they're smaller organizations, so I'm like, maybe you don't have that money, but you have something else that I know this other community organization needs. So I'm going to barter with you so that you can give free classes or speaking or whatever to the smaller organization. I think the same with museum work. For the last few years, about 95% of, like, our out of OTP, or sorry, other than personnel funding,
Yeah.
to use jargon, but, like, we are trying to redistribute to smaller organizations that are often led by Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer artists, because we also realize there's a huge gap between the funding that larger white dominant institutions receive and the funding that smaller grassroots institutions, which really have been embracing all of this jargon, not jargon, I'm sorry, but all of the language that
Yeah.
now people are saying as jargon or they're saying as buzzwords, they've been riding on that language for years. So how do we do the ethical work of aligning our values with our practices, our values with our language, and our values with our budgets? Because that's the big thing.
Yeah. Well, and I
Are
think
we
that's
putting our money on
also
it?
right. And it's
Yeah.
like I feel like there are so many conversations, especially these days, but in conversations in museums where people talk about, like, we want to work in a more anti-racist direction, or
Yeah.
we want to bring
Yeah.
that lens more actively into our work, but how do we do it? Or, like, what are the concrete things we can do? And it's stuff like that. It's like, so take your budget and support smaller organizations who don't have the funding that you as the larger organization does, or
Yeah.
be really transparent about who you want to hire as the consultant and why. Like,
Exactly.
if you really want to prioritize hiring Black and Indigenous and people of color, or if you want to really prioritize hiring queer folks, like name that. You don't have
Exactly.
to, sort of, like, oh well, we try to be diverse in our hiring. It's like
Oh my gosh, I'm so sick of it. Or not looking at the intersections between class and or socioeconomic levels in education and race as well,
right.
right? We're not looking at those nuances as much as we could as a field, or even the nuances of who has, like, positional power within our institutions. I've worked with a number of institutions who are very proud that maybe they are hiring more people of color, but they're hiring them for internships, right? And the reality is that there are black and brown people who could have been hired as managers and directors. Like, don't get me wrong, internships are a great start, but they don't for somebody. But there are Black people who have led and continue to lead with limited funding in our communities that could be hired in these other organizations. Can somebody clap in the comments if you agree with me on that? Like,
I'm gonna clap
something.
in the comments. Clap, clap.
Somebody clap if you agree with me. Like, that don't necessarily have to come through the internship, right? There are 40-year-old people who can get hired now.
Yeah.
And I think the other part is, like, that we have to, like as institutions, we also aren't always as specific as we can be about community. Like, community is often used as just a filler word for everybody else,
Yeah.
you know? And so
The
we
other
talk about
people.
the other people, right? So
Yeah.
when a lot of times we'll talk about the public, right? And when we talk about the public, oftentimes we mean, like, and to take it from literature, but to think about those people who have been historically deemed as normal within the U.S., right? And so that might be, and y'all take this word lightly about this idea of normalcy, but those people who are white, who tend to be Christian, who tend to be middle aged, who tend to be middle class or upper middle class, um, and those people who tend to be heterosexual or cisgender, right? And those people who tend to be deemed able-bodied or able-minded, although we know that, those are fuzzy words as well. And so that tends to be the public. That's the people that we're kind of talking about, like, oh, our bigger events are more funded, of the most funded exhibitions, right? They go to the public. The stuff that goes to the least funded department often is relegated to community. Education does community programs. And I think that's really interesting now as we look at all these museums, because a few months ago in March, man, let me tell you, everybody was emailing me. I got to cancel this. We don't have any money for DEAI work. This is sorry. It's got a first thing that's got to go. Education is cut, right? People that you and I know, Rachel, for years who have been leading the field lost their jobs,
Yeah.
right? Who have been
Yeah.
doing that work. And then George Floyd was murdered, and something awakened in people, and they caught the word anti-racist, and now, oh, we have money for DEAI, we're making plans, education is the leaders. And I'm like, the difference between March and June has been phenomenal.
And I do feel like there's something weird about the fact, and I don't know what it is. I don't have a theory about this exactly, but I do think there's something about the fact that the current kind of rise of um, like all the Black Lives Matter kind of uprisings and
Mm-hmm.
revolution, like in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and all of these recent spate of Black people being killed by police, the fact that it was happening during this kind of quarantine, pandemic, uncertain layoff period of time, I feel like there's something about that I don't really know what it is, but it like galvanized a larger amount of attention to this, because it's not like these are new issues, right? It's not like there was not problems with police brutality
Mm-hmm.
before. But it's like, and that is like both frustrating and encouraging to me at the
Can
same
I can
time.
I can I lay sounds out? I
Please.
see some y'all
Yeah,
gonna hear this from me. This is my
please.
first live, and I'm gonna go in. White people were home and had time. I'm just gonna say that the conversation is not new at all, right? My partner and I, we were talking. We were like, it feels like we've been running a marathon, and all of a sudden, everybody
Yeah.
started sprinting, and
Yeah.
that's not bad. I'm glad everybody's sprinting, running, but I recognize it's because white America has had time to sit down and reevaluate some things about their personal lives. Everybody's questioning themselves, right? They're questioning their lives. And they're all of a sudden like have time to be like, man, this is a screwed up situation. It's a screwed up government. It's a screwed up society. Money's not flowing. The dream that I thought I had is not real. And now, oh shoot, those other people over there, they're getting like executed. And all of a sudden now things are sinking in, and people, I'm hearing from people who I haven't heard from in years, who are like, I am sorry you had told me this. I'm in a little group chat with some Black women who are like, just been getting a lot of gifts and calls from people also who are like, I feel like from experiencing white guilt. And so I think that's part of that moment, right? That's
Yeah.
that vulnerability that, like, yeah, I see you in there, um, Allison, that vulnerability, right? That has made people
Yeah.
listen a little bit more, and that's also sparked empathy. My question is now, what do we do now that that empathy is there to hold on to it? Because we don't want to lose that empathy. Because when we lose that empathy and we get back into what we talked about earlier, that haste, that sense of fear, that product, busy, 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 like busy equals good or something, right? Then we're going to lose that opportunity to really create something new that actually expands our communities, our way of life, our possibilities for ourselves, and let us live abundantly.
And I feel like that it's like that model of abundance that you keep talking about and living abundantly. It's like that feels like such a, it shouldn't feel revolutionary, but it feels like such a revolutionary thing to kind of
Mm-hmm.
turn your focus to in a culture that has like the scarcity model is like the model of capitalism, right? I mean, not to, again, like we could just for any of you watching, Keonna and I have a long history when we both lived in Brooklyn of we would run into each other on the street and we would stand there and talk about this stuff for like hours at a time.
Always
Um,
in front of our favorite Indian spot.
I know.
Indian restaurant. Yeah. Anyway.
Shout out to Pearl Indian in
Yay,
Crown Heights.
Pearl. Go buy
Um,
some food.
support your local restaurants. um, but I do feel like it's like that shift from a scarcity model to an abundance model
Hmm.
is like really fundamentally different. You know, I think that's one of the places where you've been talking about, like, you know, communities of color, especially, or, you know, like some of the specific partnerships or organizations that you've been working with have been talking about this stuff forever, right? Like, it's not new. But this larger shift in organizations and institutions towards abundance and away from scarcity, it's like, I don't know how that's going to happen. I want it to happen. I want to be part of trying to make it happen. I don't fully know how. It's something I'm keeping wrestling with. It's part of why I like being in conversation with people like you.
I think it's possible though, because we make, especially in education, you are used to making $1 out of 15 cents, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
look at the Department of Education. Now, the Department of Education has a lot of issues.
Yeah.
It has a lot of issues. I'm not going to sit here and lie. However,
As we
we saw
currently sit here not knowing whether schools will be in
exactly,
person or.
exactly. But we saw so many teachers and principals like completely just like making things happen with almost no resources. And I'm not saying that we want them to continue to do that without resources, but the potential of doing something when you do believe in it, I think is really important. And then also this place, I do want to say, which is to that abundance, understanding that like fear is what has allowed us from creating systems changes. The fear of like a lack of abundance, that the idea that we're operating from a deficit, stops us from making like new space for other people.
Yeah.
It's like I don't have enough to share. It's like actually you have plenty to share, and maybe it's not even about thinking that 1 + 1 = 2. Like, how do we move our thinking to like, okay, 0 + 0 could equal 1,
Yeah.
depending on how we flip it, right?
Well, that abundance can look different ways, right? Like if people, like if you only have the 15 cents and you need to get to $1, it's like, do you have to finish that out by 85 more cents, or can you finish that out by like, and here's like a bouquet of fresh flowers, and here's, I don't know, I'm just
Yeah,
looking around at things in my immediate environment, like, you know,
yeah. Or maybe we
can
start out
you
with 15, and we get somebody else, and we, build something, we make it 25, and then we put 25 over here, and that turns into 50, right? I
right.
mean, there's different ways of getting to that. Um, I do want to say though, I think, for institutions, and this is the thing I've been talking to a lot of other institutions about, and my own, it's like how, and in my own department, because I'll speak for my own department, I can't speak for the whole institution, but how do we really clarify our principles? Like I have my own anti-racist principles. Like Mara Dewhurst and I, we developed a set of those principles, and at some points we realized that we were getting so caught up in trying to help everybody, that we were losing our principles and our interactions with people and our interactions with each other. And we're like, no, we got to get grounded, right? Because if we're doing this work, we have to make sure that we're fully aligned. I do want to share a couple of those principles if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
please.
Yeah, and
That'd be
just jump
great.
in. Because I think that they're worth listening to. We're working on an article now. When it comes out, y'all can read it. It'll be free online. But these are principles for implementing anti-racism, to guide our anti-racist thinking. They're they are principles because we know that the manifestations of them are going to take a lot of different forms. So, the first one is understanding that equity harms everyone. I'm sorry, inequity harms everyone. Sorry, equity, and
I was
equity
like,
lifts
wait.
up everyone. No,
Yeah.
inequity harms everyone. Everyone lifts up everyone. So no, I know you said that you come to this as a white woman with higher education background and relative privileges, right? And yes, inequity is going to harm some people more than it harms you. Absolutely. And you're also harmed by it, right? If I can use
Yeah.
you as an example, right? Like, who could you be, or if you didn't have to um, feel, if you didn't have been forced or socialized within certain practices that were socially defining parts of your identity, right?
Yeah.
If we understand like that, actually those boxes, those restraints actually harm everybody.
Yep.
And then that prioritizing people over objects. This is really hard for a lot of museums, right? I mean, I have someone who's very dear to me and on this chat, Michael Reback, who was, I don't know if
Hi,
Michael would be able to
Michael.
say that, but it's always talking about like, like he reminded me too of like, when is it time to sell collections? When is it time to like let part with objects, right? Is there an opportunity for that, especially in these moments now where we're thinking about our staff and we're in a health pandemic, right? We're not in a we're in a cultural shift, right? But we're really in a health pandemic
Yeah.
where we need to
Paintings
put,
are, yeah,
yeah,
paintings are not being infected with COVID-19. People
exactly.
are.
People are. And like, what does it mean to make sure that the people in our community, the people that we've been building with are okay?
Yeah.
Like, how do we prioritize them? And even after COVID, or before COVID, right, there are still people who are connected to our institutions, our stories, and people who haven't been connected, right? The histories, you know, I have ancestors who were traded for goods, who were deemed to be goods, right? And so I need to elevate their humanity. And in doing that, whether it's the teaching I'm doing, whether it's talking about provenance, right? How do I make sure that we are never equating people with objects?
Yeah, and
Or,
and I do want to bring in this one comment, and I know there was a really
yeah,
good question from Amina, which I'll come back to, but this comment from Nora about that there are so many terrible takes out there by art historians right now prioritizing aesthetics over human rights, and
yes,
that includes some leaders of very prominent, high-profile institutions,
yes,
and like those things don't have to be one or the other, but definitely in the priority scale, the human over the
absolutely.
object should.
It's true. No, it's absolutely true. And it's just like, well, for whom? Like,
Right.
that tells me that like you might not be for everybody you claim you're for.
Yeah.
Um, the another one is recognizing that oppressive systems have privileged some people, at some groups of people at the expense of others, and still do. I think that's the awakening moment we're happening, right? With George Floyd, right? People are like, oh, sitting at home, like, oh, how did I miss this? Like, I've heard that question over and over again. How did I miss this? And I think that's a good question. We have to continue to say that
How
to
did you?
ourselves.
Yeah.
Even if I look at like, there's some things I'm really embarrassed about if I even think about like things that I have been missing when it comes to disability justice. And I'm like, how did I miss this? Well, I missed it because I am in a place of privilege, and I missed it because I wasn't trying hard enough to look for it, to
Yeah.
find it. If
And I
I'm,
think it's also, it's like going back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation about a time for self-education, right? Like
mm-hmm,
some of that self-education is not just like, okay, I will like read the book by XYZ thought leader, but it's also that self-examination piece of like, what have
yeah,
I been missing? Why have I
yeah,
not heard these
yeah.
conversations?
And we're all doing it, like everybody, like even folks who are leading conversations are missing pieces. That's why it's so important to be in community around them, or be in a collective space around them. Um, there's been a lot of talk. The next one is honoring multiple narratives and diverse ways of knowing. There's been a lot of talk around that over the last, I would say, at least the last 15 years that you and I have been in museums. Is it about to rain there, Rachel? Because it looks rainy.
It
So
might, but there's an awning if I need
there's a
to run
little
in.
girl running in the background. So I was like, what's happening?
I have learned in Colorado sometimes it rains out of nowhere, and then it usually
Oh,
ends the rain out of nowhere too. But I'll
uh,
duck in if I need to.
I got you. I got you. It's raining here. Sorry, y'all. We had to take a rain break. I had to check in on my girl. Um, but like those narratives, right? What are the stories we've been told? Like, I mean, we're seeing all these monuments come down, or monuments to really a lot of Disney villains. I hate to, Columbus and all of these people who are, I mean, genocidal. So, I mean, those are some like, more prevalent narratives. But like, even when we think about the artworks that we have on view, like the haste of rushing and not slowing down and think about like what other stories does this tell, right? Even the story of it being here, the story
Yeah.
of the caretaker, the story of the person who restores it, right? What stories can people create with it? Maybe there are future stories, right? I'll give that credit to um, Ray Ferreira, who's on here too, who pushes me a lot to remind myself that like Black futures are about resilience, and that we have to continue to think about.
Like uh, that he talked about in Mining the Museum of way back when. It's like, it's not just the people who own the stuff whose story can be
Yeah,
told through the stuff, right?
yeah, and in DI work, I mean that's a whole nother thing, but I feel like there are a lot of collectives of DEIA folks in museums that honestly don't include any guards. They don't include custodial. They don't include folks who are on an hourly wage, or it's a lot of like middle management, coordinators folks. And, don't get me wrong, a lot of the education, full-time education folks, but like, how do we get other, like most of the people of color are in museums are in operations. So how do we get them at the table in ways that are not pandering or like playing in on like that savior syndrome?
Yeah.
You know? And that comes back to the next principle, which is building trust and sharing power with oppressed communities, right? So, it may be, just giving that space for meeting time. Like, how do we listen and like not ask somebody to send us, 5 or 6 articles or send in their resume to trust what they're telling us, but that's a lived experience. And then another one is focusing on actions that result in equitable redistribution of power. I think that it always comes back to that, like everybody has good intentions, but what what am I going to do to actually redistribute power? Does that share power? And then in doing so, making sure that the actions we take don't result in harmful consequences for oppressed communities, whether intentionally and unintentionally. There are a lot of folks out there now who are like, I am standing with Black Lives Matter, but they're standing and taking up way too much space. And I say that from a place of love, to my colleagues who may be reacting rather than responding, and or allowing their colleagues of color or colleagues who have been in these conversations for a while to actually take that lead too. Um, and thinking about what are the consequences of that, because it does have harmful effects. We've lost a lot of incredible people, you and I know, in our
Yeah.
field. We've got a lot of partners who will say no to us because they don't trust us. And honestly,
Yeah.
why should they? I've gone to
Right.
schools where people are like, if you're going to work with us like this, if you're going to give us money and then take it away, we'd rather you not come, because that's not fair, and it creates a sense of paternalism.
Yeah.
And then I think, there's just two more I want to share. I'm sorry, but
No, it's fine.
understanding that equity work is ongoing in the collective process. And we talked about that earlier, right? Like,
Can I be the like raise hands emoji right
yeah,
now?
raise your hand. Because, I really want challenge everybody on here right now to think about and when, watch for one, when are you going to get tired and fatigued from doing this at work? And then see the people around you, when are they starting to get tired, and how their language changes, how their attitude and responses to people who are feeling harm, and it might come out in rage and anger, like how are those responsive changes? Because those are the moments when you kind of got to call folks in and be like, hey, this is not going to be as fast as you thought it was going to be. This is going to take some time, and you got to be patient with it. And then the last one is really just centering joy and community building in our process for dismantling racism and equity. I hear a lot of people say, like, oh, it's such a burden to take on this. And I'm like, it is a privilege. It is a joy to build community. Like, creating space for people should be joyful, Like, I don't know. I don't know what to say. Like, if you don't think it's like, it's actually a joy to actually share with people, to bring people in, then maybe you haven't really shared from a place of genuine care. And that might be sounds aggressive, but I really do like that work has to be joyful. You have to find some joy in that.
Yeah. And I think it's like, that doesn't mean it's easy, right?
No.
Like, hard is not the same as what's the opposite of joyful? Like, sad or,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, um,
It's not going to be, it's not, doesn't mean it's not going to be easy, or it's not going to be harder. It's not going to be exhausting, or that you
right.
won't want to give up, but there has to be moments of joy in that.
Yeah.
There
And
has to
that
be
is the,
moments of pleasure, and also like just the privilege. Like, I think about it a lot on like, I'm inheriting the work of my ancestors, right? I'm inheriting what they taught me, and I'm putting it into practice, right? That's the community, and hopefully I'm creating some room for Black people to breathe
yeah.
in doing that. Seeing that happen, that makes me feel good.
Yeah. And I do think that's the piece. And so I do want to go, and maybe this is like ending with joy is kind of maybe a nice way to
Um,
end our our conversation, but I do want to go back to that question that Amina asked about, do you think museums and cultural institutions will change how they engage with education departments and community programs when museums open back up? And if so, how?
Oh, can
And
we?
I feel like,
Oh, go ahead. Can
yeah,
we also invite other people while we're live to type their responses to that question
yeah,
in the
please. I was
chat?
going to say,
Because I think there's
please.
a lot of like, well, which institutions? That's the big one. But go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
There are a lot of really great educators and thinkers on this on this chat. So please feel free to chime in with your own thoughts in the comments, and I'll read them out loud. But I guess I would say it's like I don't know how. I don't know that I have like an answer to that question, but I have hopes,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like that joy piece and the like genuine human connection piece is part of what I hope will
Yeah.
come as an increased focus as museums start to open in this time when people have been so isolated and so cut off from that joy and that community building. So
Yeah.
I do want to read some comments. We've got a couple people chiming in. So we've museums are sites of education that the education department shouldn't be in a silo. It shouldn't just be the education department who's doing these programs. Co-signed heartily. um, and and Keonna saying thank you,
Hi, thank you.
miss you and your energy. Oh, and then and mom, my mother is chiming in saying that not thinking that humans will ever willingly give up power, and I do think that is part of the ongoing struggle because I agree.
Girl, I think there will always be some power shifts, and I think anytime you're working within an institution, and institutions that exist in a
Yeah,
society that are built on hierarchies, like yes, then no, like no. I do think we will see pockets of change, and I think we are seeing pockets of change. I think a lot of that is conditional, right? It's how hard are we willing to push as museum educators? Two, how hard are we willing to break away and like create our own stuff? And it may be, I've always I love the John Cotton Dana. I'm a museum nerd, y'all. I like the John Cotton Dana approach to like having museums as satellite spaces, like libraries, so that the museum can actually do what the community center should be funded to do. That would be my approach to like education moving forward. But I think we have a lot of power now as educators to really like help institutions like look for better ways.
yeah,
Or some institutions look for better if leadership is willing to listen. It really takes leadership to be willing to listen. It
yeah,
takes boards to be willing to fund and fundraise. And it takes staff members who are willing to make sure that the work isn't just nuanced or like isn't just housed in like one particular department. And that's gonna be I'm gonna say it like a lot of this depends on curatorial, because
yeah,
curatorial power is really about that knowledge making, or this idea of like the story. And so everything I just listed was about disrupting that's the way they
yeah,
work. So until curators are really ready to share their power and to
yeah,
let educators and interpreters and visitor experience folks come in and they build out these narratives together, then it's
yeah,
not going to change. But if the curators are really willing to do that, because they're the sites, they're the fathers of these museums, right?
yeah,
Right.
totally. And
So yeah, I'm
I
sorry.
totally agree. And I think the way Ray put it, and we're also about to run out of
Oh,
time on
we're running out of
Instagram
time.
Live,
Sorry.
because we obviously like keep talking about this stuff forever. But I think the way Ray put it is like, initially you want to cackle, but really we have to think about like restructuring and reprioritizing who listens and who speaks.
Yeah.
Um, and I want to make sure I thank you before we get cut off.
Oh
But
yeah, because
thank you
I can talk
so
forever.
much, Keonna. I really appreciate it, and I love you, and you're doing the good work.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. Thank you for having this time, having me here, and